du Bataclan, il y a 130 morts. Alors reprenez, ici c'est chez nous.
Over the past decade, France has been hit by a series of Islamist terror attacks. In 2020, the beheading of a high school teacher sparked outrage across the country, prompting the government to pass a law putting restrictions on how Islam is practiced in France.
Ce à quoi nous devons nous attaquer, c'est le séparatisme islamiste.
Critics accused President Emmanuel Macron of using this law to appease the far right, which presented a growing threat to his party ahead of the 2022 elections. The government responded to these accusations by banning a far-right group called Génération Identitaire, or Generation Identity. Over the previous 10 years, Generation Identity had fundamentally reshaped far-right activism, not just in France, but across the world. My name's Tim Hume, and I cover the rise of the far-right in Europe for Vice.
Nous sommes la génération de la fracture ethnique, de la faillite totale du vivre ensemble, du métissage imposé.
In 2012, an ominous black and white video appeared online. It featured a series of people railing in French against a so-called forced mixing of races and what they described as an explosion of anti-white racism.
Ne vous méprenez pas, ceci n'est pas un simple manifeste, c'est une déclaration de guerre.
Generation Identity had been born.
Nous sommes la génération identitaire.
Not long after the manifesto video was launched, Generation Identity filmed themselves on top of a mosque that was still under construction in the French city of Poitiers, waving flares and chanting anti-Muslim slogans.
Central to the way that this movement does its business is a thing called metapolitics. And that's about saying that they need to capture culture in society and politics would happen downstream from it. And so Generation Identity don't stand in elections, for example. What they do is they do these stunts that they think will shock people, but also normalize things like anti-Muslim rhetoric in the public space. And with that normalization with time, they change the culture that allows Islamophobia to become more normal and more acceptable, which allows them to change society.
Generation Identity pushes the so-called Great Replacement narrative, a conspiracy theory that holds that Europe is being invaded and its people replaced by immigrants.
The ideology of replacism is wrong. Once you replace one population with another, it will not be the same.
The phrase was popularized by the French anti-immigration writer Renaud Camus and has since become a rallying cry for white supremacists around the world, including those who carried out mass shootings in El Paso and Christchurch.
Europe is colonized by Africa in a much deeper way that Europe ever colonized Africa, because the colonization is now demographical, so it's much more serious.
In response to this so-called invasion, Generation Identity turned to using coded language to mask their dangerous and racist solution, which they termed remigration.
Generation Identity says you have to get active or be replaced. Generation Identity actually have this really pernicious idea that the way they would do this is essentially make life in these European countries so difficult for non-white people that they choose to leave. Hence, they will remigrate away from Europe.
You want to make life difficult for people that are not from your culture. Forbidding the veil, for instance, forbidding the selling of halal foods.
Dans une société délirante où les islamistes arrivent à s'infiltrer au sein de nos plus hautes institutions.
In the end, if people are not living on their own will because you've made their life here impossible, you end up deporting them.
While Generation Identity's ideas were simply decades-old far-right narratives rehashed for the age of YouTube, what set the group apart was the style in which they were presented. Generation Identity deliberately left behind the violent, skinhead associations of the old far-right. They tried to make its ideology respectable, perhaps even aspirational, with a slick, clean-cut aesthetic.
Generation Identity is a youth movement, right? It consciously targets young people. And to do that, it means they dress in a certain way. It means their videos are produced in a certain way.
They wanted to fend off all accusations of racism. So basically, they turned to culture to not talk about race because they know that the accusation of racism or Nazism or fascism could politically discredit the movement.
Et ce qui nous rassemblait, ce qu'on avait au cœur, c'était cette défense de notre pays, cette défense de l'identité française et européenne que nous avions tous compris qu'elle était aujourd'hui menacée, qu'elle faisait face à un grand danger.
You can wave a nice flag and you can wear nice trainers and have a nice haircut, but the fact of the matter is these are fascistic ideas being repackaged, right? And they can pretend that's not the case, but time and time again we've seen that is the case.
This media-savvy approach, combined with a series of summer camps that featured a mix of lectures and self-defense classes, brought Generation Identity an international following, with chapters forming across Europe.
At the end of 2019, early 2020, the Generation Identity had branches in around 9 countries. And they actually had over 63 regional branches there. It got to the point where actually it became a significant transnational far-right movement across Europe.
In particular, the Austrian branch and its leader, Martin Sellner, emerged as online stars of the fast-growing movement.
The most important person was Martin Sellner, and still is.
Every right-wing politician who's criticizing immigration is literally Hitler. And we are fed up with this. We are no racists, we are no anti-Semites or neo-Nazis. We just want to preserve our own ethno-cultural identity.
And from the beginning, there was this big fascination with him because he was young, he was charismatic.
What we are fighting now, first and foremost, is a free and open and fearless debate about the Great Replacement.
As Sellner's star began to rise in the mid-2010s, a series of brutal jihadist terror attacks in Europe shocked the world.
After the terror attacks, they changed their discourse and they linked immigration to terrorism. All of a sudden, migrants are all presented as a potential terrorist threat.
On réclame notamment la remigration pour tous les djihadistes binationaux et étrangers. On réclame la fermeture de toutes les mosquées islamistes.
This is even how they framed, for instance, the refugee crisis. And that's why they demanded that European countries close their borders.
Generation Identity sought to exploit the attacks to justify their ideology and recruit more members. The group crowdfunded to charter a boat, which they planned to sail around the Mediterranean, harassing NGO ships which were trying to rescue migrants from drowning.
We will confront the NGOs on the open sea and tell them what the majority of Europeans think about their activities.
And here was a huge new step in far-right activism because actually this was putting people's lives at risk. And of course it got a huge amount of press. Martin Sellner was at the front of this.
But despite their grand name, Defend Europe, this stunt ended up as an embarrassing failure. The ship's equipment broke down, leading to them having to be rescued by one of the very NGOs they'd come to harass. But for Generation Identity, actually blocking migration to Europe was only ever a secondary concern.
If you want to follow us, you can do it on Twitter, on Facebook, or on YouTube.
The real point of the mission was to generate publicity, and in that, they succeeded. The stunt got Generation Identity, and Sellner in particular, on the radar of the American far right, creating crucial new opportunities for fundraising.
At the time, the alt-right was a big movement in America, and you saw a lot of the key figures in that movement, including really extreme neo-Nazis like the Daily Stormer website, the biggest and most extreme neo-Nazi website in the world, threw its weight behind Defend Europe. David Duke, the former Ku Klux Klan Grand Dragon, said you need to donate to this.
We're talking about the ethnic cleansing of America and the destruction of the American way of life.
In 2018, Generation Identity tried to build on this publicity by launching another Defend Europe operation. This time, they threw on matching uniforms and trekked into the Alps to try and stop migrants from crossing from Italy into France.
One border, one nation, stop immigration!
Eh bien, si le migrant force le passage, c'est très simple. On appellera la gendarmerie qui aura l'obligation d'intervenir, de prendre en charge le migrant qui est en situation illégale en France, et la justice fera la suite.
It's doubtful whether the mission actually stopped a single migrant from moving anywhere. But once again, that was never really the point. The idea was simply to capture strong images for social media. But the problem with creating a movement focused on courting publicity is that eventually the authorities started to pay attention.
It did make lots of people who weren't taking them seriously, especially from a security perspective, say, actually, hang on a second, this isn't just people dropping banners. This is a big far-right movement that's coming across Europe and doing pretty extreme activism.
But when Generation Identity's downfall did arrive, it was triggered by events on the other side of the world.
This is CNN Breaking News.
Police in New Zealand are urging people to stay off the streets and to avoid mosques in the coming hours after mass shootings at 2 mosques in the city of Christchurch.
On March 15, 2019, Brenton Tarrant murdered 51 people at 2 mosques in Christchurch, New Zealand. Tarrant was a white supremacist who had disseminated a manifesto titled The Great Replacement. It gradually emerged that in the lead up to the attack, he had donated money to Generation Identity and exchanged emails with Selner, who had invited him to meet for a beer if he was ever in Austria. This link with Tarrant exposed the lie that they were supposedly a peaceful, law-abiding organisation.
The terrorists of Christchurch had money to give and singled out the Austrian identitarians for his donation.
And this goes back to the idea is if identitarians say, get active or be replaced, he decided to get active. And the way he got active was to get weapons and go and kill 51 people. And this is what's so dangerous about identitarianism.
In the wake of the Christchurch attacks, social media organisations began a slow process of de-platforming Generation Identity, pushing them onto smaller, more obscure platforms and severely impacting the way they operated.
It affected them deeply because especially YouTube and Facebook, they had such a broad audience that it was always very easy for them to fundraise.
In January 2021, Generation Identity in France tried to regain some of this momentum by launching another anti-migrant mission, this time in the Pyrenees.
Nous appelons également la jeunesse de France et d'Europe à se révolter contre l'immigration massive et la destruction de notre identité. Cela commence avant tout par la protection de nos frontières.
But instead of generating YouTube clicks or stopping any migrants, the stunt only contributed to their eventual demise. A couple of months later, in March 2021, the French government slapped a ban on the group.
Par cette décision, nous mettons fin aux activités parfois violentes d'un groupe qui avait, depuis fort longtemps, coupé les ponts avec la République. Génération identitaire ne défendait plus des idées, il en était le bras armé de l'extrémisme et de la xénophobie.
The activists cannot organize any kind of demonstration under the name or symbols of Generation Identity. What the government attacked by banning Generation Identity was the brand. They can't use their brand anymore.
Et je pense qu'il y a une indignation générale face à cette atteinte grave à la liberté d'expression, justement à cette liberté d'association. Nous, ce que nous avons simplement voulu faire, c'était défendre nos frontières. Et nous avons encore le droit en France de critiquer sa politique migratoire qui est désastreuse, et ça, c'est un fait.
Liberté d'expression.
But many people question how effective the ban will be.
I think a ban can be effective, but we shouldn't be naive. The people don't go away, but they have to regroup, they have to rethink, they have to try to escape the laws.
But despite the decline, the manipulative tactics and ideas of Generation Identity look set to impact the far-right scene in Europe for years to come.
I think one of the things it's been very successful at is they have managed to find a language that allows them to portray extreme ideas in a moderate way. They have managed to find a means of activism which excites some young people. And they have managed to present themselves as a movement that gets things done. These ideas are no longer just talked about on these quite extreme demonstrations that GI do. You could hear it from far-right political parties and even just right-wing political parties in various parts of Europe.